And this is called Buck and the Lost Gold of Hell's Gate Canyon. As a way of contributing to fund the projects, I went on a couple of treasure hunting adventures with new friend Tim that will be fun to share. These happened between the years of 2016 and 2018. Funding had not yet manifested, so Tim and I wanted to see if we could get something going. The dark forces are always watching us. They definitely don't want the new friends around waking people up to their true potential. Funding for all humanitarian projects was supposed to be granted many years ago, but still hadn't manifested. The negative entities can see what's going on in the physical astral realms, and they see us as threats to their control, even though we are not here to take them down. Everybody has a right to have their experiences, and so do we, unimpeded. Our projects are meant to provide a public service and give people an opportunity to wake up from their slumber. While we're still working on the funding, Dwayne had a real side experience where he saw a small hand reaching into a cavity in the earth and listened to the jingle of coins. Not immediately making any connection to anything particular, he finally did the next day when Tim, one of our new friends from Grants Pass, Oregon, mentioned the lost treasure of Buck's Mountain. There was the connection, and here was an adventure. Dwayne and I discussed what had been shown, and we decided it was worth a try to travel up to Oregon to do some treasure hunting. I was more than willing because I am up for adventures. If we found the hidden treasure, it may give us enough resources to start some of our major projects. After taking my usual weekly trip up to the Bay Area from Huntington Beach to work my gardening route, I would drive another 7 hours to Grants Pass, where Tim and I would search for the treasure for the week, and then I would drive back to the Bay Area again for work. I sometimes went back to Huntington Beach after my 15 jobs and sometimes went back to Oregon. I took a total of 4 to 5 trips up to Oregon. Here is one story told by a resident of Grants Pass that knew Buck. It seems that Buck was a construction worker of some sort back in the day and had met and befriended an alcoholic Indian. The Indian was sickly and fell ill. On his deathbed and sensing that he was heading to the happy hunting grounds, the Indian pulled something from his meager belongings and told Buck he wanted him to have it, in thanks for the kindness he had shown him. Buck was handed a parchment, or more accurately, a tanned piece of leather with inscriptions, markings, lines, and an X to mark the spot. The Indian told Buck that the map was given to him by his mother, who was a small girl who was witness to an amazing story. A story of white men enslaving Indians to work gold mines in southern Oregon, and later their daring rescue and escape. It seems the Indian girl was part of a tribe that lived along what is now known as the Rogue River. The white men had enslaved the tribe's able-bodied men to work their mines and left the women, children, and old men of the tribe to their own devices. The mine work was hard and little concern was shown for those enslaved. Many died from overwork and abuse. The women, children, and old men suffered as well, as their hunters were no longer bringing home meat. Something had to change. The Indians knew that on occasion the white men would transport the gold via wagon to a nearby town. The trail took them along the hillsides above the Rogue River, and in particular what we know as Hell's Gate Canyon. During the transport of gold, most of the miners accompanied the wagons for protection, leaving only a few men behind at the mine to oversee and guard the Indian slaves. The route was scouted and known by the Indians, so a plan was devised and would be carried out by those still free, the women, children, and old men of the tribe. The tribal members' plan was to trap and kill the miners as they brought their gold to town at a location and time they were most vulnerable, and then surprise the remaining miners back at the camp and free their men. The plan was put in motion. First, the tribe dug a large hole or cavern into the side of the mountain just off the wagon trail. They then lined the cavern with dry brush and wood. Next, they lined both sides of the main trail coming from the mines with dry brush as high as a man could stand. In addition, they made a wagon width off-ramp path from the main trail to the cavern's mouth. Lastly, they piled rocks and dirt above the cavern's entrance, held back by logs that could be sprung free at a moment's notice. The trap was ready. Now they waited and watched for the next gold delivery by the white men. The plan was simple, and the day arrived. The white men were moving along the trail. The women and old men of the tribe took their assigned places and lay in wait, hidden along the trail. Once the wagons and horseback riders passed into the portion of the main trail walled with dry brush, the Indians closed off the rear with brush and then set all the brush piles on fire. This blaze acted as a guardrail system leading to the newly created off-ramp and cavern. Indians with torches and blankets jumped from the hiding and positioned themselves behind the wagons and horses, whooping and waving lit torches, forcing the horses to instinctively move forward away from the ruckus. The horses, in a panic, galloped forward, following the free-line trail, seeking escape, only to follow the off-ramp and into the cavern. Once in the cavern, which had to be big enough for wagons, horses, and men, the Indians fired flaming arrows into the brush inside the cavern and then sprung free the stored rocks and dirt down from above, sealing off the cavern's entrance and leaving the wagons, horses, and white men to burn to their deaths. Not caring about the white man's gold, the Indians then continued covering the cavern's entrance with dirt and local vegetation to hide what they had done. The next step was carried out with ease, and that was overpowering those white men left at the camp and freeing their men. During the telling of this story, Buck interspersed appropriate long pauses for effect and an occasional Indian war whoop that made both young and adult leap from the park benches. We waited and begged for more. According to Buck's Indian friend, his mother witnessed the actual attack on the white men and the ensuing details, including freeing the Indian men from their captors. However, the place on the hillside was not lost from the tribe's memory. Every year or so, several braves would go to the hillside and ensure the place where their freedom quest began was still undisturbed. They documented their visit with a blaze in a tree not 50 yards from the cavern's entrance. In her later years, the witness, the Indian's mother, secretly marked down the location of this revered place, thinking that someday that gold may have some use for her family. Using a piece of tanned deer hide and charcoal from the warming fires, the Indian's mother wrote as best she could the location of the cave and buried white man gold. Thus, a real-life treasure map was born. The map was secretly carried by the Indian woman for many years and later handed down to her son, the man befriended by Buck. Using his last breaths, Buck's Indian friend recounted this story and handed Buck a piece of rolled-up tanned leather wrapped with a leather lace. Buck untied the leather lace, unrolled the leather parchment, and inscribed thereupon was a map showing the location of the buried wagons. Buck was familiar with the area as described by both the Indian friend and the map. It was clear the X was on the hillside above what we know as Hell's Gate Canyon on the Rogue River. Buck moved to the area and prospected for the location of the buried treasure. Once he found indications he was near the spot, he built a very rustic cabin and set about living there on a permanent basis, searching for the hidden gold. However, years of searching had led to frustration. It seems that every time he dug a tunnel into the hillside, the loose overburden would cave in, nearly trapping him and burying him alive on 2 occasions. He spent his life savings on the search, but he needed more help and/or equipment. We, of course, offered our help, and surprisingly, Buck offered to show us his cabin and dig. So off we all went. Me, my cousins, later sister, and 4 adults into their 30s. We crossed the bridge and then followed Buck left for a few hundred yards along a narrow trail. For proper orientation, this first trail took us upriver from the bridge toward Unuversal. Then, like a mountain goat, Buck headed straight up the hill, following a well-worn footpath. The climb lasted for a good 30 minutes, Buck leading the way, carrying a light backpack, unfazed, while the rest of us grasped for air like pollywogs out of water. The forest surrounded us now and turned dense, sunlight barely filtering down through the boughs. Undaunted, we did our best to keep up, and our anticipation only increased with every step. Just to interject, this is not Tim and I, this is the fellow that was with Buck at that time. The trail now leveled out somewhat, and soon we could see the outline of a building through the trees. Buck's cabin was as he described, mountain man living at its best, Spartan living at the worst. Inside, a Coleman lantern and a few candles provided light when needed. A bed lay on one corner, and I do not recall running water of any sort. Artifacts from his days of digging lay on the rough-hewn wooden table. Buck first showed us a piece of charred wood, no doubt a piece of the burnt wagons, he said. He also had pieces of wagon hardware and an assortment of bones, whether human or horse he could not say, but most certainly proof of the Indian's story and the map's veracity. Next, we were shown the dig site where he searched for the gold-laden wagons. It was obvious that this was an unstable hillside that would require significant investment in reinforcing timbers as one tunnel to history. Buck then wanted to show us a stand of trees nearby with scars or blazes carved in the bark. Many of the scars were repairing themselves and growing back over, but on other trees there were more contemporary blazes. Buck mentioned that every once in a while he would get a strange feeling that he was being watched. And sure enough, he would go to the area of blazed trees and see a fresh blaze. Buck believed that on a recurring basis, the Indians were still watching the place and him. Shivers ran down our backs as we quickly looked around to see if even now we were being watched. Buck said he never saw them and never had any interaction with them, but he knew they had been there, and so did we. Night was near, so we headed back down the trail to the bridge and park, eyes wide open in our discussion on Buck and the lost gold of Hell's Gate Canyon, as we determined the unsolved mystery should be named. Buck eventually had to leave his cabin, which was on federal forest land. The hippie movement of the 1960s and 70s resulted in many flower children squatting in abandoned miners' cabins in the national forests. While not really hurting anyone, permanent abodes are not allowed in the forests unless you are working an active mining claim. So a general edict was handed down from the Great White Father in Washington, D.C. to rid the forest of squatters. Many cabins were burned to the ground, and sadly, I am told Buck's was one of them. Buck retired to the city, where he spent many days at Riverside Park playing all-comers and checkers. I ran into Buck the final time in the late 1970s. The sparkle in his eyes was still evident, and the flowing white beard and hair were unchanged. Buck wore city clothes now, but I was still mesmerized by the mountain man who ran up the hills like a goat and chased buried treasure like a Caribbean pirate. Buck passed away in 1990 and took with him a great legacy of intrigue. If any others have heard Buck's first-hand accounts, it would be great to compare them and see if we cannot craft a more complete and richer story, so it is not lost when we are gone. Perhaps future generations can think wistfully of an era gone by not so long ago, and even inspired to one day search for the lost gold of Hell's Gate Canyon. This was just one of the versions of the lost treasure. Tim had heard another. 16 mules carrying payroll for the soldiers stationed along the Oregon coast was attacked by Indians who overtook the detachment, killed the soldiers, and stole the gold. They had no use for the gold, so buried it in some caves below a lake. Many years later, an earthquake caused the caves to collapse and to flood them from the lake above. After some investigating, Tim and I found where Buck had dug a 30-foot hole on the side of the mountain and lined it with cement blocks. Our sources led us to believe this was where the treasure could be. A challenge we were faced with, though, was that there was an underground spring that constantly filled up the hole to around 20 feet in depth. How to drain the water so we could climb down there to find the treasure. We managed to drag up a generator so we could set up a sump pump. We could not stay ahead of the volume of water coming in, so next we set up a siphoning system with a PVC pipe. It took over 24 hours to get 15 feet of water out of the hole. The remaining 5 feet of water we had to deal with because the depth of the hole prevented any more siphoning. Obtaining a wetsuit, goggles, an underwater flashlight, and air line, we used the generator to provide air to us as we submerged down into the water to see if we could find a lateral cave at the bottom, where we hoped to find a cave with the gold in it. All this took 4 to 5 trips up to Oregon to locate the gear and equipment, drag it up a mile and a half up the hill to the location of the hole, and finally get down there. Once we made the descent to the bottom through the cold spring water, we found bedrock all the way around with no lateral cave opening. Why did Buck spend so much time and effort digging the hole? Was he digging deeper and had to stop? Were we in the wrong location? Many questions, no answers. We used our seer friend Claudie, as well as other psychics, to help guide our project. I camped in the area to try to intuit some information. We asked the Indians on the real side to show us where the treasure was because it was to be used for the benefit of humanity. If there were any Indians assigned to guard it, we assured them it was for a good cause, and they could show us where it was and let it go. When Tim was younger, he went up to Buck's Mountain on a hike. He looked up on a ridge and saw 5 wicked-looking Indians staring down at him, and he knew they meant business. Tim turned around and didn't look back as he ran back down the mountain. He hadn't been up since that day. Were these the guardians of the gold? We still don't know, but we never found the gold. It was a good try, an adventure to share in this book. There is a greater adventure waiting all of us than looking for lost treasure, and that is the ongoing recognition of the all-is, which is the true treasure. Beyond anything physical or anything in creation, we can come upon an isness that is totally awesome and just is.